questions?
Parents who use drugs have children who use drugs.
At around 11 AM on the 4th of May 1953, writer Aldous Huxley took 4/10ths of a gram of mescaline, which had been dissolved in a glass of water, sat back and analysed the ride. The mescaline had been provided by British psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond, who had been staying at Huxley's house in Los Angeles at the time, and who had been in correspondence with Huxley since March. Huxley had initiated the correspondence having been intrigued by Osmond's research program, which involved the use of LSD and mescaline in helping psychiatrists to understand and treat mental illnesses. The two would thus write to each other frequently, and when Osmond mentioned his plans to come to Los Angeles to attend several APA sessions, Huxley offered for him to stay at his house whilst he did so, an incredibly rare offer for Huxley to make. When Osmond arrived in late April, the two got on immensely. However, whilst the two spoke on a number of subjects both through correspondence and in person, the real subject Huxley wanted to broach with Osmond was mescaline. Yet, Huxley did not want to talk about the history of mescaline, its effect, or its potential for treating the mentally unwell. No, he wanted to try it. Huxley had felt too awkward to admit this to Osmond, but fortunately, Huxley's first wife, Maria, knowing Huxley's true intentions, brought up the subject 2 days before Osmond was set to return home. Osmond admitted he had mescaline on him, and whilst feeling trepidation at the idea initially, agreed to give some to Huxley. And what occurred changed Huxley's perception forever. The trip would last a few hours and be a mind-opening experience for Huxley, who wasted no time in writing out his experiences, resulting in the 1954 publication of his essay, titled after a William Blake quote, "The Doors of Perception." In the essay, Huxley makes it apparent that his interest in taking mescaline amounted to more than simply wanting to trip. He had instead wanted to thoroughly analyse the drug's effects on his perception and consciousness. To do so, Huxley set down a tape recorder and had Osmond and Maria watch over him whilst the effects of the mescaline began to take hold. Huxley explains his innate inability to visualise events or objects in his mind. He concedes that he can barely conjure up an image of what he had done the day prior. Having read up on mescaline in the past, Huxley had presumed that the drug would alter this and flood his mind with vivid images and symbols. But this was not the case. In fact, Huxley says that the changes in his perception of the world around him were in no way revolutionary. At no time were there faces or forms of men or animals. I saw no landscapes, no enormous spaces, no magical growth and metamorphosis of buildings, nothing remotely like a drama or a parable. The other world to which mescaline admitted me was not the world of visions. It existed out there, in what I could see with my eyes open. The great change was in the realm of objective fact. What had happened to my subjective universe was relatively unimportant. This change would take 30 minutes to occur from the moment Huxley took the drug. The change he is referring to is first related to a vase containing 3 flowers that sat in his study, the colours of which had been illuminated. Huxley thought of this illumination as if he were witnessing the miracle of naked existence. At this point, either Osmond or Maria, it doesn't specify who, asks Huxley whether it is agreeable, to which Huxley responds, "Neither agreeable nor disagreeable. It just is." Huxley soon turned toward the glowing books on his shelf. He then explains to the reader how the sober mind tends to view a scene in relation to place and distance, whereas the mescaline experience disregards these measurements and instead focuses on the intensity of existence, profundity of significance, and the relationships within a pattern. Time as well was altered. Huxley felt as if everything had slowed down, and when asked what he felt about time, he could only respond, "There seems to be plenty of it." After marvelling at the shapes and structures concerning a desk, a wicker chair, and a small typing table, Huxley begins to theorise on the meanings of his heightened perception and consciousness and how it relates to the brain. Huxley finds himself agreeing with Cambridge philosopher Dr. C.D. Broad, who believes that the brain filters out a large portion of the universe due to it being useless to our survival. Huxley explains this concept and uses the term mind at large to describe our potential for what we could perceive without the filter our brain possesses. According to such a theory, each one of us is potentially mind at large, but insofar as we are animals, our business is at all costs to survive. To make biological survival possible, mind at large has to be funneled through the reducing valve of the brain and nervous system. What comes out at the other end is a measly trickle of the kind of consciousness which will help us to stay alive on the surface of this particular planet. Huxley then goes on to explain how we chalk up this limited consciousness into symbols and language which describe the funneled world around us, and in doing so, reinforce the idea that our limited perception is all there is. Huxley also breaks down into 4 parts what typically happens to the majority of people who take mescaline. Firstly, the ability to think straight remains. Huxley comments on how he was surprised how clear his thought process was whilst under the influence, and that when listening back to his tape, he believed he did not sound like a man high on mescaline. Secondly, the visuals are intensified. Huxley says that the eye recovers some of the perceptual innocence of childhood. Additionally, the mescaline user's interest in the space around him and time itself will diminish. Thirdly, the will of the user is reduced to 0. The mescaline user will feel no desire to do anything and would prefer to sit and stare. Lastly, everything will be better should a user take the drug with sound liver and mind. These effects of mescaline are the sort of effects you could expect to follow the administration of a drug having the power to impair the efficiency of the cerebral reducing valve. When the brain runs out of sugar, the undernourished ego grows weak, can't be bothered to undertake the necessary chores, and loses all interest in those spatial and temporal relationships, which mean so much to an organism bent on getting on in the world. As mind at large seeps past the no longer watertight valve, all kinds of biologically useless things start to happen. In some cases, there may be extrasensory perceptions. Other persons discover a world of visionary beauty. To others again is revealed the glory, the infinite value and meaningfulness of naked existence, of the given, unconceptualized event. In the final stage of egolessness, there is an obscure knowledge that all is in all, that all is actually each. This is as near, I take it, as a finite mind can ever come to perceiving everything that is happening everywhere in the universe. Following this, Huxley continues to marvel at the intensely bright colours visible and mentions the many reports from psychics and mystics whose experiences relate to Huxley's own. For the rest of the essay, Huxley continues to recount his drug-addled experience whilst analysing the role consciousness plays in its unravelling. He talks about art, has a brief attack of fear, and discovers meaning in draperies, the 4 legs of a chair, and in the crinkles of his own trousers. All the while, Huxley is guided by Osmond and Maria, who watch over and document his every move, and as Huxley, many hours later, begins to feel the effects of the mescaline wear off, he writes about the returning to normalcy as returning to the state of what is unsatisfactorily referred to as being in one's right mind. Huxley had gone through the door and returned a changed man. He realised that the mescaline he took had done more than simply send him on a trip. It had expanded his consciousness and provided him with a deeper appreciation for the world around him and all of its beautifully unexplainable elements. With this newfound passage, Huxley sought to champion the door through which he had passed and beckon others to follow his lead, believing everyone could benefit from experiencing the other side, even if it was only for one time. But the man who comes back through the door in the wall will never be quite the same as the man who went out. He will be wiser but less cocksure, happier but less self-satisfied, humbler in acknowledging his ignorance, yet better equipped to understand the relationship of words to things, or systematic reasoning to the unfathomable mystery which it tries, forever vainly, to comprehend. One day, one man would step through the doors, a few years following Huxley's first trip, and that man would return time and time again, eventually spreading what he had discovered and defining an entire decade by influencing a generation to heighten their consciousness with psychedelics. But before we get into that whole thing, there is a chemical elephant we need to address. Drugs. You may have heard of them. You know, those things that take you someplace else or enhance an experience, or better yet, expand your very understanding of yourself and yourself's place in this thing we call the universe. Sound familiar? No? Well, some are legal and some are illegal, but some used to be legal but are now illegal, but also some used to be illegal but are now legal. If you've ever listened to Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds and thought, what the fuck are they on about? Why does it sound like that? Who is this Lucy character and why is she in the sky with diamonds? Well, it's because Lennon, McCartney, Harrison and Ringo, like pretty much everyone else in the 1960s, and I'll get to that, don't you worry, all slipped and fell into the well of psychedelics, causing them to ditch the songs about holding hands and twisting and shouting in favour of writing songs about what some enthusiasts so delicately refer to as the good stuff. I think we all know, or have met someone, or ourselves have, at one experimental point in time, smoked, popped, sipped or dipped our idle hands into these delicious and nutritious magic beans, stalks, bushes and cushes that we call drugs. Drugs have been influencing all types of art for centuries. Whether in music, painting, filmmaking or writing, using drugs to help inspire creativity in a craft has been a common technique among creatives. Samuel Taylor Coleridge famously took opium frequently throughout his life, and even wrote poems detailing his visions whilst under its influence in the late 1700s. In a similar vein, writer Thomas de Quincey published the first book to describe the effects of drugs in a personal account in 1821. The book was called Confessions of an English Opium Eater. There is a plethora of drug categories that I could go into in this video. However, I want to focus on a category that I believe had the biggest influence on literature, that being psychedelics. The term psychedelic was coined by Osmond in 1957. Osmond had decided on the name whilst in correspondence with Huxley, who had initially suggested to Osmond that he should use the word phenerothine. He accompanied this suggestion with a rhyme. To make this mundane world sublime, take half a gram of phenerothine. Phenerothine would come from the Greek words for to show and spirit. Osmond obviously disregarded this suggestion in favour of the word psychedelic, which came from the Greek words psyche for mind or soul and delone for show. Osmond had his own rhyme for the term. To fathom hell or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic. This term was then made official when Osmond announced it at the New York Academy of Sciences meeting in 1957. I have tried to find an appropriate name for the agents under discussion, a name that will include the concepts of enriching the mind and enlarging the vision. My choice, because it is clear, euphonious and uncontaminated by other associations, is psychedelic, mind manifesting. But what are psychedelics, I hear you ask? In short, psychedelics are drugs that produce hallucinations and an apparent expansion of consciousness. Mescaline is found in the San Pedro cactus, located in the Andes. It is also found in the peyote cactus, which can be found in Mexico and in the southwestern United States. During the Second World War, the Third Reich used mescaline on concentration camp prisoners to see if it could be used as a truth drug during interrogations. The US Office of Strategic Services was testing similar theories with mescaline in different ways. Yet, by the mid-1950s, mescaline was largely disregarded in research labs in favour of lysergic acid diethylamide, otherwise known as LSD. In 1947, President Harry S. Truman signed the National Security Act of 1947 into law, thus giving birth to the Central Intelligence Agency. With the Cold War at its height in the 1950s, then director of the CIA approved Project MK-Ultra in 1953. Whilst there were a number of goals under the umbrella of the project, the main objective of the operation was to develop mind control techniques through the use of drugs. The clandestine experiments went on for 20 years, and in that time, 150 human experiments were conducted with electric shock therapy, paralytics, and psychedelics. The majority of experiments took place between 1953 to 1964 and were mostly conducted in universities, hospitals, and prisons. Some test participants didn't know what they signed up for, and others did know. One notable participant in these experiments was writer Ken Kesey, who signed up for the program whilst in college in the early 1960s. Kesey was low on money at the time and signed up purely for financial gain. However, upon discovering the transitional effects of LSD, Kesey would spread the word, and in doing so, would kickstart the hippie subculture that dominated the entire 1960s. Kesey would thus become a cultural icon, spreading the word of LSD and using it to help influence his writing. But most infamously, he would host massive drug-induced parties with his crew, the Merry Pranksters, who would call these parties the acid tests.
But the Intrepid Trip's production at the moment is the acid test. Yes, okay. Once again, the change.
Before Ken Kesey would be known for his 2 breakout novels, his acid tests, and his band of Merry Pranksters, he was a college wrestler who had done a little writing. As mentioned prior, Kesey had volunteered to be experimented on in the late 1960s, and emerged from these experiments convinced that psychedelics had much more to offer the human psyche than a recreational trip. Much like Huxley, Kesey had his perception permanently altered, but instead of accurately recounting his experiences in a sober, analytical and clinical fashion, Kesey had instead seen psychedelics as being beneficial creatively and thus sought to write while still under the influence. And that he did. When not sneaking the drugs out and supplying them to friends, Kesey was taking them home, ingesting them and proceeding to write. He thus started on his first novel, which at times he would write whilst under the influence of LSD or peyote. Often the end result was 90% gibberish, but that leftover 10% was gold, and would wind up in the final draft of the book Kesey published in 1962 called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. The book was an immediate hit, and Kesey soon followed it up with Sometimes a Great Notion, published in 1964. However, by 1964, Kesey had felt himself drift away from what he saw as the restrictive medium of the written word. This drift would come around the time he would be about to set off on an infamous road trip from his house in California, all the way to New York and back in a day-glow painted bus full of his band of Merry Pranksters. On the front of the bus were painted the words Fervor, which became its name. Kesey had formed the Merry Pranksters not long after he had been exposed to psychedelics. The pranksters were a group of like-minded friends who took psychedelics with each other and dressed up like hippies before hippies were even a thing. By 1964, the pranksters were living at Kesey's house and would contribute massively to the road trip, as well as the acid tests, which would begin not long after. The stories of the merry pranksters would be told time and time again, yet nobody had captured the feel, the freedom, and the experimentation Kesey and his gang had embodied, as much as the journalist Tom Wolfe did when he documented the story of Kesey and the pranksters in his 1967 book, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test is Tom Wolfe's most famous book and was pieced together through interviews with Kesey, audio tapes, footage, and from what Wolfe had witnessed himself. The events included within the book begin chronologically with Kesey's involvement in the MK Ultra experiments and end with Kesey's arrest. Between these two events lie all the LSD craziness, the road trip in the Dayglow bus further, and of course, the acid tests. The acid tests were parties where the venue they were hosted in consisted of psychedelic decorations such as strobe lights and projected psychedelic visuals in an attempt to recreate the feeling of being under the influence. These parties were held between 1965 to 66 with Kesey's involvement, and in them, pranksters would distribute LSD. Additionally, the band The Grateful Dead would often play at these parties, and the attendees were often notable names themselves. Some of these names include Neil Cassidy, Allen Ginsberg, and Timothy Leary. Hell's Angels would often show up too. Wolfe makes mention of Huxley's The Doors of Perception, whilst likening Kesey's psychedelic and spiritual discovery to Huxley's own. How many? Maybe 24 people in the world were onto this incredible secret. One was Aldous Huxley, who had taken mescaline and written about it in The Doors of Perception. He compared the brain to a reducing valve. In ordinary perception, the senses send an overwhelming flood of information to the brain, which the brain then filters down to a trickle it can manage for the purpose of survival in a highly competitive world. Man has become so rational, so utilitarian, that the trickle becomes most pale and thin. It is efficient for mere survival, but it screens out the most wondrous part of man's potential experience without his even knowing it. Wolfe documented the events of Kesey and his band of merry pranksters in a style of journalism befitting the experimental air of the time, which would later be called the New Journalism. Whilst a few writers were contributing to the emergence of this new style, it is the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test that is the quintessential New Journalism book. There are many factors that contribute to New Journalism, many of which Wolfe would later outline in his 1973 anthology, but the simplest way to sum New Journalism up is that it is essentially the reporting of events with literary techniques. Wolfe achieves this in the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test through the constant use of stream of consciousness writing, as well as by changing the point of view of the person recounting the events. In regards to the former, Wolfe would often use stream of consciousness writing to relay the effects of LSD onto the page. Often Wolfe's sentences would go on and on without any worry about being grammatically correct, yet it works to convey the nonsensical and formless feel of being under the influence. In regards to the latter, Wolfe would change the point of view simply to add to the storytelling aspects of the book. In the 20th chapter, sharing the title of the book, Wolfe retells the events that transpired when Kesey was hiding in Mexico as a fugitive. To convey Kesey's paranoia, Wolfe used letters Kesey had written during the time and relayed them in the book as Kesey's interior monologue. At the end of the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, Wolfe included a note that explains where he got his sources of information from and why he chose to write the book in the way he did. A note on the writing of this book. I have tried not only to tell what the pranksters did, but to recreate the mental atmosphere or subjective reality of it. I don't think their adventure can be understood without that. Despite the recounting of what happened, Wolfe also shared his thoughts on why what was happening and what it all meant. As Huxley had discovered in 1954, the pranksters had come to understand that everyone was in some way connected to everyone and everything. A revelation only perceivable through the use of psychedelics. What they all saw in a flash was the solution to the basic predicament of being human, the personal I, me, trapped mortal and helpless, in a vast impersonal it, the world around me. Suddenly, all in one, flowing together, I into it, and it into me, and in that flow I perceive a power, so near and so clear, that the whole world is blind to. The pranksters had come to be aware of this connectivity, and this awareness had influenced their power as a group. Seeing themselves as all connected brought on an almost religious zeal to their group, and Kesey would further strengthen this with a saying reiterated by him and the pranksters, which was that you were either on the bus or off the bus. Being on the bus or off the bus was essentially saying you were either in or out, you were aware or unaware, you're either divine or not divine. It was basically a way of judging whether you were on the group's wavelength and were understanding of the deeper spiritual implications beyond merely tripping for the sake of tripping. You could physically be on the bus without being on the bus. Yet, despite the very black and white nature of Kesey's on the bus off the bus statement, the exact message or overall goal of those who consider themselves on the bus was never clear to Wolf, who, at the end of the day, couldn't help to sometimes view the whole story of the pranksters as nothing more than young adults enjoying life in what way they saw fit, whilst following the directions taken them by their altered, psychedelic, LSD-infused states. For that matter, there was no theology to it, no philosophy, at least not in the sense of an ism. There was no goal of an improved moral order in the world, or an improved social order. Nothing about salvation, and certainly nothing about immortality or the life hereafter. Hereafter, that was a laugh. If there was ever a group devoted totally to the here and now, it was the pranksters. I remember puzzling over this. There was something so religious in the air, in the very atmosphere of the prankster life, and yet one couldn't put one's finger on it. On the face of it, there was just a group of people who had shared an unusual psychological state, the LSD experience. Years after the release of the electric Kool-Aid acid test, in 1989, Kesey was asked by an interviewer whether the events depicted in the book were accurate. Kesey responded with this: "Oh yeah, it's a good book. Yeah, Wolf's a genius. He did a lot of that stuff. He was only around 3 weeks. He picked up that amount of dialogue and verisimilitude without tape recorder, without taking notes to any extent. He just watches very carefully and remembers." As I briefly mentioned prior, the events depicted in the book included all the LSD craziness and fun times, but it also detailed the arrest of Kesey and his subsequent walking away from the hectic life of the merry pranksters. In other words, Kesey got off the bus. Kesey had 2 charges of drug possession against him in the mid-1960s, and to avoid jail, he fled to Mexico. After some time of paranoia, Kesey returned to the US and faced his charges. Kesey went on trial and wound up getting a lesser sentence than expected. He was given a $1,500 fine, was made to work on a farm for 6 months, and spent 3 years on probation. After his charges, Kesey retreated to his father's farm in Pleasant Hill, where he focused on raising his children, writing, and helping out his father. In later years, Kesey would still champion the benefits of psychedelics. Additionally, he would note the hypocrisy of those who smoke tobacco and drink alcohol whilst turning their noses up at psychedelics. There's 27,000 people a year killed here in alcohol-related deaths. You don't see any big thing about alcohol being evil. There's how many people smoking and dying of it. Why is it that people think it is so evil? What is it about it that scares people so deeply? Because they're afraid that there's more to reality than they have confronted. That there are doors that they're afraid to go in, and they don't want us to go in there, either because if we go in we might learn something that they don't know, and that makes us a little out of their control. The doors of perception had opened Kesey and his band of merry pranksters up to a whole new way of life. Instead of indulging in the regular 9-to-5 life their parents likely would have preferred them to, the pranksters sought to live according to their terms, taking psychedelics along the way, and unknowingly, at the time, setting the blueprint for the hedonistic yet optimistic youth culture of what we now refer to as the swinging 60s. Kesey died at the age of 66 on the 10th of November 2001. He would lead a quiet life and would occasionally release books whilst lecturing on the side. Hidden on the farm Kesey would remain on until his death was the Day-Glo painted bus Further the pranksters had used time and time again, whilst high on a number of drugs on some journey with God knows what purpose. This bus would be a friendly memento of what he and his pranksters had done, and on days where the mood was melancholic or reflective, Kesey would walk down to the discreet location on his farm where it was hidden, to be reminded of simpler times. In Huxley's The Doors of Perception, we experience a man trying to dissect his psychedelic experiences. In Wolf's The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, we saw these psychedelic experiences told from the perspective of a sober mind. In these next two books, we will witness the consequences of not only just taking psychedelics, providing anecdotal stories on their effects, and championing their conscious expanding abilities. No. In these next two books written by the collaborative writers Alexander and Anne Shulgin, we will see what happens when you do all of the above with psychedelics, whilst providing recipes on how to make them. Alexander Shulgin, often referred to as Sasha, was born in Berkeley, California. Sasha's chemistry career began when he studied organic chemistry at Harvard, but he soon dropped out and joined the Navy at the age of 19. After the Navy, Sasha received a bachelor's degree in 1949 and later a doctorate in biochemistry in 1955 from the University of California, Berkeley. After receiving his doctorate, Sasha soon began working at the Dow Chemical Company, where he soon began focusing on the creation of psychedelic drugs. Sasha's fascination with psychedelics began in the late 1950s when he took mescaline for the first time. Like Huxley, Sasha had discovered a way to perceive parts of the universe hitherto closed off. The most compelling insight of that day was that this awesome recall had been brought about by a fraction of a gram of a white solid, but that in no way whatsoever could it be argued that these memories had been contained within the white solid. Everything I had recognised came from the depths of my memory and my psyche. I understood that our entire universe is contained in the mind and the spirit. We may choose not to find access to it, we may even deny its existence, but it is indeed there inside us, and there are chemicals that can catalyse its availability. Sasha thus began his psychedelic research in his lab at Dow Chemical. Yet, despite his dedication to his research, Dow Chemical did not want to be associated with Sasha's psychedelic findings, which led to Sasha publishing his findings in scientific peer-reviewed literature. Over time, Dow Chemical became more and more uncomfortable with Sasha's publishings, containing their company as his return address, and so, Sasha used his personal home address instead. But it wasn't enough. With mounting pressure from Dow Chemical becoming more of a hindrance to Sasha's research, he eventually decided to build his own lab in his home so he could continue his research in peace. By the mid-1960s, Sasha left Dow Chemical and committed himself fully to his research, whilst lecturing on the side. To prevent complications with the law, Sasha obtained a Federal Drug Enforcement Administration Schedule I license, which allowed him to possess and synthesize scheduled substances. Sasha threw himself into his work. He would often test substances on himself to experience their effects, and then would rate them on a scale of his own making. As well as this, he would often hold gatherings, where he would distribute these substances to friends, to get their thoughts on them too. Sasha would publish his findings when and where he could. In 1978, Sasha, whose wife had recently passed away, met Anne Perry, who was going through a divorce. Anne was a psychedelic enthusiast and would soon participate in Sasha's psychedelic research. She would become another psychonaut. Sasha and Anne were married by 1981. Throughout the years, publishing Sasha's findings became more difficult due to the nature of the findings being published, leading to Sasha and Anne coming up with the idea to write and publish a book under their own publishing company called Transform Press. That book turned out to be Pekow, A Chemical Love Story, published in 1990. PCAL stands for Phenethylamines I Have Known and Loved. The book is broken up into two parts. First part tells the love story between Sasha and Anne, as well as their experiments with psychedelics, and how they use them as tools to study the mind. The story bounces between Sasha and Anne's perspectives. The book is like a longer and more varied version of The Doors of Perception, as Sasha and Anne detail the benefits of the many psychedelics they experimented with. However, with the benefits come the very real detriments to relying on these drugs, which the two do not hesitate to highlight to the reader. Use them with care, and use them with respect as to the transformations they can achieve, and you have an extraordinary research tool. Go banging about with a psychedelic drug for a Saturday night turn on, and you can get into a really bad place, psychologically. Know what you're using, decide just why you're using it, and you can have a rich experience. They're not addictive, and they're clearly not escapist either, but they're exceptionally valuable tools for understanding the human mind and how it works. The second part of PCAL contains plenty of substances Sasha either made or tested. The section contains 179 psychedelic compounds, as well as their effects on the mind, as well as recipes on how to synthesize them yourself. If you're pretty deep into chemistry, you'll understand this part, but if you're not, like me, you're fucked. Sasha and Anne chose to make the second part of PCAL available for free by posting it on a non-profit independent drug information website called Erowid. Upon its release, PCAL was received well by some. Sasha and Anne's celebration of psychedelic drugs and their benefits in exploring the mind ruffled a few feathers within the scientific community and within the government. And then, in 1994, the day of the invasion arrived. One day, Sasha's lab was raided by the DEA, and his license was taken away. With no license, no lab, and nothing to lose, the two decided the best course of action was to write a second book. Anne was born on the 22nd of March 1931 in Wellington, New Zealand. Due to her father's work, Anne moved around frequently at a young age. She went to Sicily, Trieste, Cuba, Canada, and then the US, where she attended High Mowing School in New Hampshire. After this, she studied commercial art in San Francisco. Anne would go on to work on and off as a medical transcriber. In her spare time, she would draw and paint. Like Sasha, Anne too had tried psychedelics early in her life and had a revelatory experience that opened up a whole new perspective to her. I saw something forming in the air, slightly above the level of my head. I thought that it was perhaps a few feet from me. Then I realised I couldn't actually locate it in space at all. It was a moving spiral opening, up there in the cool air, and I knew it was a doorway to the other side of existence, that I could step through it if I wished to be finished with this particular life I was living, and that there was nothing threatening or menacing about it. In fact, it was completely friendly. I also knew that I had no intention of stepping through it, because there was still a great deal I wanted to do in my life, and I intended to live long enough to get it all done. The lovely spiral door didn't beckon, it was just matter-of-factly there. TCAL, the continuation, was published in 1997. TCAL stands for Tryptamines I Have Known and Loved. The layout of the book is more or less the same as PCAL. The first half is a little less linear than PCAL, as the two's love story has already been told. Therefore, TCAL acts more like a collection of essays than a cohesive narrative. The first chapter begins with the raid the two experienced in 1994, and it tells the story behind Sasha's license being taken away. The chapter is called Invasion. On the day of the invasion, the DEA found a drug sent anonymously to Sasha. Sasha received anonymous drugs frequently, and he often discouraged the sending of them. However, most people did so with the thought process that they were the only ones, which led to Sasha having multiple random drugs around the lab. When the DEA discovered these drugs laying about, they leveraged their findings in order to force him to give up his license. Basically, if he hadn't done so, Sasha would have to pay a fine for every single one of these unknowable and ownerless drugs. Yet, despite getting Sasha to give up his license, the DEA still slapped him with a $25,000 fine that he and Ann were fortunately able to raise money for. As for the rest of T-Cow, it is very similar to P-Cow. The book contains more writing on Sasha and Ann's psychedelic experiences, as well as a second part that includes recipes and detailings of the effects of multiple compounds. Like P-Cow, the second part of T-Cow was made free to read. Both P-Cow and T-Cow are still selling at a steady pace today. For the rest of their lives, Sasha and Ann continued on their spiritual journey and would give talks on psychedelics and their two now iconic books. During the talks they would give, the two would often hint at the publishing of a third book. Unfortunately, no such book has been published and the two authors have since passed away. Alexandra Shulgin died at his and Ann's home in San Francisco on June 2nd, 2014. He was 88 years old. Ann Shulgin too died at their home on July 9th, 2022. She was 91. Sasha and Ann contributed and sacrificed a lot in the name of spreading the word about their belief in psychedelics benefits. The two believed that psychedelics had much more to offer a human than a recreational pastime. They believed they could be used as tools for the mind, a way to understand ourselves and our place in the world. Like Huxley and Kesey, psychedelics had opened up doors they forever found themselves re-entering. Maybe their third book could have provided some more information on the matter. Maybe someone close to the couple has been working behind the scenes to piece up a third book. The writing is out there somewhere, just waiting to be released. I guess only time will tell. When Aldous Huxley published The Doors of Perception in 1954, the book was met with mixed reviews. Like Kesey's views on psychedelics, as well as Sasha and Ann's, their opinions were slated by the mainstream, yet found celebration in subcultures. Huxley was baffled by people's reaction to his essay, and particularly, like I mentioned with Kesey previously, the hypocrisy behind the demonization of psychedelics in a world where alcohol and tobacco are readily available. How odd it is that writers like Belloc and Chesterton may sing the praises of alcohol, which is responsible for about 2/3 of the car accidents and 3/4 of the crimes of violence, and be regarded as good Christians and noble fellows, whereas anyone who ventures to suggest that there may be other and less harmful shortcuts to self-transcendence is treated as a dangerous drug fiend and wicked perverter of weak-minded humanity. But despite the backlash, Huxley would continue to experiment with psychedelics, and in the twilight years of his life, the late 1950s to early 1960s, he would lecture on his experiences with mind-altering drugs. Huxley felt as if he had nothing to lose in sharing his experiences so openly, as he was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1960. Yet, even though he went all out on sharing his experiences, there was a part of Huxley that dismissed the idea of dying. Unfortunately, Huxley was no longer able to continue on as if nothing was happening by 1963, as he was forced to his deathbed where he was to face the grim end of his diagnosis. On November 22nd, 1963, Huxley was laying on his deathbed with his second wife Laura Huxley by his side, as well as 5 other people in the room. Laura was catering to Huxley's every wish, and after organising his will, Huxley motioned for a piece of paper. On the paper he wrote, "LSD, try it, intramuscular, 100 micrograms. Laura thus got the correct dose of LSD into a syringe and injected Huxley with it. After a few hours, she gave him another dose, and within a few more hours, Aldous Huxley stepped through the doors for the last time, never to return again, as he peacefully passed away at the age of 69. After his death, Laura wrote a long letter detailing the event of Huxley's death to Huxley's brother and his brother's wife. In some of the final lines of this letter, Laura conveys the unusual lack of struggle Huxley faced upon dying, which was coaxed along peacefully with the help of LSD. I had been warned in the morning that there might be some upsetting convulsions towards the end, or some sort of contraction of the lungs, and noises. People had been trying to prepare me for some horrible physical reaction that would probably occur. None of this happened. Actually, the ceasing of the breathing was not a drama at all, because it was done so slowly, so gently, like a piece of music just finishing in a sempre più piano dolcemente. I had the feeling actually that the last hour of breathing was only the conditioned reflex of the body that had been used to doing this for 69 years, millions and millions of times. There was not the feeling that with the last breath, the spirit left. It had just been gently leaving for the last 4 hours. In the room the last 4 hours were 2 doctors, Ginny, the nurse, Rosalind Rajagopal. You know she is the great friend of Krishnamurti, and the directress of the school in Ohio, for which Aldous did so much. They didn't seem to hear what I was saying. I thought I was speaking loud enough, but they said they didn't hear it. Rosalind and Ginny once in a while came near the bed and held Aldous' hand. These 5 people all said that this was the most serene, the most beautiful death. Both doctors and nurse said they had never seen a person in similar physical condition going off so completely, without pain and without struggle.